Thanks so much again, everyone, for being here. The next person I'll introduce, I'm really excited to, is Rob Henderson. He writes about human nature, psychology, social class, TV shows, movies, political and social divisions, and more. He is perhaps most known for pioneering the concept of luxury beliefs, a term he coined to describe a new way of understanding the American status system. He grew up in foster homes in California. After working as a busboy, dishwasher, and supermarket bagger, he joined the Air Force at the age of 17. Most of his enlistment was spent abroad in Europe and deployed in the Middle East. Once described as a self-made man by the New York Times, he then obtained a BS in psychology from Yale thanks to the GI Bill, which is working for me right now. Let's see that. And a PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge, St. Catherine's College, where he studied as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. He's a columnist at the Free Press and the Boston Globe and has written for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among other outlets. He has also appeared on podcasts, including Honestly with Barry Weiss, the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, and Modern Wisdom with Chris Williamson. His debut book, Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class, is a national bestseller, and recently negotiated some feature film rights recently, so we're congratulating him for that. And please join me in welcoming Rob.
All right, thanks Colin, thanks Sarah, and thanks to David, who is not with us, but helped to organize this event as well. And yeah, thanks to all of you for being here. Yeah, the New York Times did not call me a self-made man. They just used the term self-made. You know, they can't use those gender terms. But that was back in 2015, so they could still occasionally acknowledge that someone had made it on their own without attributing it to luck or systemic forces and so on. So they did use the term self-made, which still sometimes, when I think about it, surprises me. So I wrote this book, Troubled, while I was still in grad school, roughly from 2020 to 2022. Those were the main years that I got the manuscript out. And sometimes people ask me, you know, what was it like to write a memoir at such a young age? And I did feel a bit of self-consciousness about it. At that point, I think I started writing it when I was 29, and I spoke with this professor at the University of Cambridge, expressing some of these concerns about, you know, am I too young for this? Is this a mistake to be taking on this project at such an early age? And he, in this very posh British accent, said, like, oh, it's an American tradition. You know, young people in America love to write about themselves. And he was referring to, I think, books like Hillbilly Elegy, Educated by Tara Westover. I think Obama was maybe 33 or 34 when he wrote Dreams from My Father. And so that, among other experiences, gave me the confidence and the focus I needed, I think, to take the book seriously. And in some ways, it was an advantage, I think, to write it early because, you know, the older you get, the harder it is to retrieve older memories. You know, I've spoken with older academics and writers and professors, and they tell me that writing a book at a young age can be beneficial because a lot of the people in your life are still alive. I had this conversation with an older professor at Yale, and he is working on his memoirs, and he's telling me, you know, the older you get, the more your friends tend to die, and so it becomes harder to corroborate and retrieve those memories and recollections. But for me, these memories were very fresh. I still have notes. My friends are still around. I spoke a lot with my younger adoptive sister, who I write about in the book, and we were able to essentially see how much our recollections overlapped, and they did quite a bit. And so in the preface of Troubled, I introduced the reader to my life through the origins of my name. So my full name is Robert Kim Henderson. And Robert comes from my biological father, whom I've never met. And the only information I had from him is his name, which came from some documents by some social workers who were responsible for my case when I was in the foster system in California. My middle name, Kim, comes from my birth mother. It was her family name. She came to the US from Seoul when she was very young, moved to LA, and got involved in drugs and partying and so on. And so by the time I was born, she was essentially rendered unable to care for me. And so some police came. I was 3 years old. The police came to this apartment we were living in. We were initially homeless for a time. We lived in a car. Eventually, we settled in this slum apartment in LA. Some police arrived, and they saw the sort of squalor and the neglect. And they asked my mother, "Where's this boy's father? Because you're not in a position to care for him." And she said she didn't know. She didn't know where my father was. And so a little more than a year ago, I took this 23andMe genetic ancestry test. I was curious about that side of my family, about my father and his origins, and I learned that my father was Mexican, so I'm half Hispanic on my dad's side. And when I got those results, my first thought was, I wish I'd known that when I was applying to college. Maybe I would have gone into Harvard. And my last name, Henderson, comes from my adoptive family. So I was in the foster care system for just shy of 5 years, and I moved through 7 different homes, which I concentrate on in the early chapters of Troubled. And I was adopted by the Henderson family. It was my adoptive mother, my adoptive father, their biological daughter who became my adoptive sister. And I was 7. I turned 8 years old shortly after the adoption. And I remember when I was living in the final foster home when I was 7, the Henderson family came to visit me before the adoption. They wanted to see, what I was like, and the social workers, of course, wanted to know, would we get along? And they took me to this park, and I knew there were a lot of things different about this experience compared to the other homes and placements. First of all, I'd never been visited by a family like that before, but there was a moment at the park when I referred to my soon-to-be adoptive mother as Mrs. Henderson, because that's how I always addressed my caregivers, my guardians, as Mrs. So-and-so in all the foster homes. And so I addressed her as Mrs. Henderson, and she paused and said, "Honey, you can just call me Mom if you're okay with that." And I was, and yeah, it felt good. It felt good to address someone as Mom, and my dad as well. And so we settled in this dusty blue-collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff, which is in Tehama County, one of the poorest counties in the state of California, and very working-class town. So my adoptive father, he was a truck driver, and my adoptive mother was an assistant social worker. Neither of them went to college, which was pretty typical for this town. There was a factory, there was a Walmart distribution center, very working class. There was a lot of kind of rural poverty, which I think a lot of people are surprised by. That's not often what comes to mind when people think about California. But if you travel 3 and 4 hours north of San Francisco, it's a very different region than, say, the Bay Area or LA. So about 18 months after the adoption, my adoptive parents got divorced, and there was a little bit of a custody dispute, but ultimately my adoptive father ended up severing ties with me. He was upset with my adoptive mother for leaving him, and that was his way of retaliating by cutting off contact with me. And as you can imagine, that was a very difficult experience for me as a 9-year-old kid, after never knowing my father, and then all the foster homes, and then losing contact with my adoptive father. It was painful, but I was 9 years old, and so I didn't really understand what I was feeling. I was a kid, I was unsophisticated, And I did what a lot of 9-year-old kids do when, especially 9-year-old boys, little boys do when there's not a lot of supervision at home. My adoptive mother was working. She was trying to pay the bills and make ends meet. We moved into this gloomy duplex near a gas station in Red Bluff. And she was not often home. I was this kind of latchkey kid. I'd walk to school, I'd walk home. The duplex would often be empty. And I'd go hang out with the other 9 and 10-year-old boys in the neighborhood. And we'd we'd start smoking cigarettes and get our hands on some beer, some tequila, some, later on it was like generic Vicodin. And we'd go to the gas station and buy some cold medicine and see how many of these like cold medicine pills we could take before we started to feel funny. And there was a temporary period, though, of relative stability, which I write about in the book, where my mom entered this relationship with this woman named Shelley, and they created this relatively stable 2-parent home for my sister and me. But then Shelley was shot the summer before I started high school. And I tell the details of that story and the circumstances around it in my book. But this created more sort of drama and upheaval and changed the kind of emotional configuration of the home. After the accident, Shelley couldn't work anymore. My mom was struggling to take care of her. It was financially straining. But one thing that I noticed as I was writing this book was how much my academic performance was responsive to my circumstances. So in the foster homes, I was such an unfocused student. I write about how I didn't learn to read until I was in 2nd grade. I barely knew the alphabet, and I essentially had to teach myself how to read. At one point in the foster homes, I was doing so badly in school. I was changing schools all the time, changing homes all the time, that they thought I might have had a learning disability because I was struggling in the classroom. And so they sent this psychologist to give me an IQ test. And I scored considerably below average on the verbal section because I didn't know how to read, and no one read to me or taught me to read. And in hindsight, I did find it kind of darkly amusing that you have this kid who's constantly changing schools, teachers, homes, and he's not doing well in school, and the first thing that comes to mind is to medicalize him and maybe slap a label, dyslexia, ADHD, something like that, instead of actually looking at the root of the problem, which is the home condition and his personal circumstances. So after the adoption, my grades improved quite a bit. I think I write in the book somewhere, I scored like 3rd place or placed 3rd in like the school spelling bee in elementary school. I think this must have been 4th or 5th grade. And then the divorce, my grades plummeted again. My mom and Shelley get together, my grades improved during middle school. And on the strength of my grades in middle school, then in high school, I was placed in these advanced courses, but then Shelley was shot, and this changed everything. And so I'm placed in these advanced courses in high school, and I'm barely scraping by. I'm doing the bare minimum needed to succeed. And then I encounter this problem where I think I got a B- in biology somehow, and I was subsequently placed into chemistry. And chemistry was actually a hard class. All the other classes I could kind of BS my way through, make up answers, copy, notes, whatever, and get by. But chemistry actually required some intellectual effort, and I was not ready to do that. And so I went to the school guidance counselor and asked to be placed in what we colloquially in those days called the retard classes, the classes for the dumb kids. And that was so there's sort of the smart kids went to chemistry, the less academically equipped kids went to nutritional science. And I asked him to place me into the nutritional science class. And what's funny is that, when we talk about higher education, we think, oh, it's the teachers, it's the system, it's the authority figures, they're doing something wrong. But actually, in this case, they were, my guidance counselor tried to talk me out of this. He thought I was making a mistake. He said, what are you doing? Like, you're in these advanced courses, you're on track to go to college. I know you're like struggling in some of these courses, but if you drop out of this, like that will throw off your trajectory. And I said, okay, well, whatever, like what do I need to do to change classes? He gives me this form and says, have a parent or guardian sign it and you can go into this other course. And I took the form, I forged my mom's signature, brought it back the next day, and yeah, I got placed into this other class. And I did that for on other occasions too. And so it's not as if teenagers have no agency. They respond to the conditions around them, but if they don't want to put in the effort, no matter how good a teacher is, they're not going to be able to force a kid to try. And often what contributes to that lack of academic focus is the home life, home circumstances, the family condition. And so by the time I was 17, I barely graduated. I think I had a 2.2 GPA. I was in the bottom third of my class. I was ranked like 286 out of 330 or something like that. So I knew I wasn't going to go off to college, but there were two older male sort of quasi-role models in my life who each recommended enlisting. So my high school history teacher, he pulled me aside after class one day and said, look, I can tell you're a smart kid. I don't know what's going on at home. I don't know why you're not doing your homework, but it's kind of the end of the road as far as like college goes. This was towards the end of the semester, final semester, but he said, or he pulled up a picture of himself on his computer, and it was a picture of him in an Air Force uniform, and said, this might be an option for you. You should strongly consider it. And this was 2007, and so this was kind of, the military was a more salient option, I think, in people's minds. We were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were just 6 years out from 9/11, and so, and also in this kind of conservative rural town, there was a lot of reverence for the military. And so those were kind of the two options. If you were an ambitious kid or a smart kid in Red Bluff, you either went off to college or you joined the military. Those were kind of the two paths. The other male figure was my friend's father. So my senior year of high school, for reasons I explain in the book, I moved out early. I was 16 and I moved in with my friend and his dad. And his father had also been in the Air Force, and he also recommended it to me. And so on some level, I think at that age, I was 17, kind of longing for some paternal guidance, some older male who I thought maybe had some wisdom, had my best interests in mind. They gave me this advice, and I signed up to take the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, which is the military standardized test. I signed up to take it. This was maybe Tuesday afternoon, or Tuesday morning, 10:30. I had to go to the testing center. And so the night before, I stay up with my friends. I think we just got drunk playing Xbox. And I'm like, I don't have to be there till 10:30. It's fine. And I barely wake up in time. I'm like I was definitely hungover. I might have still been drunk when I took that test. And my hair was disheveled, and I was like, I drank a Rockstar energy drink. And I took the test, and about 2 weeks later, I met with the recruiter, and he told me that I qualified for every job. He showed me that my ASVAB scores could be converted into SAT scores, and I looked at those results and realized that I could have, had I taken the SAT, which I didn't, I would have had the same score as one of my classmates, one of my schoolmates who was off to college. He was a really smart kid. And so that experience, among others, is why I've written in multiple different outlets the importance of standardized testing. It's not everything, it's one piece of an application, but if you have a kid who was raised in circumstances like I was, where maybe grades aren't the best indicator of the kid's potential, but he can set an afternoon aside and take a test. That can reveal additional information about him that you wouldn't be able to get from a GPA. I also think, like, just this is like a side tangent, but I think the arguments against the SAT are stupid because all of the arguments against the SAT can also work for GPA. So there's this idea of, oh, you can just, rich families can hire tutors and they can ace the SAT through tutoring, and that's unfair. But that argument applies to GPA. So you have a kid who from a rich family and his grades aren't doing well. That rich family can just hire tutors and boost the GPA. So every argument you can use against the SAT can also be applied to GPA. I haven't heard anyone call to abandon grades yet, but the way things are going, we'll see. Okay, so I go off. I'm 17, and I get on this bus to Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, August 2007, and it's like, I don't recommend I don't recommend going to basic training when it's like 112 degrees in Texas. We step off the bus, and it's funny, I remember when I was considering enlisting and I spoke with other military veterans and active duty, and a lot of them said, so of course, the Air Force vets are going to say join the Air Force, loyalty to their branch. But then members of other branches were like, if I could go back, I think I would have joined the Air Force. And their reasoning was, the Air Force is a little bit less physically demanding. It's more sort of intellectual. It's more about brain power than sort of brute strength. And also, plainly, the Air Force is a newer branch. It was founded in 1947. And so Air Force bases are just newer. They're more modern. I've visited Army bases before. And yeah, some of those buildings should be condemned. They've been around since the Civil War era. And so that was my expectation going in. So I step off the bus and I'm like, okay, it sounds like it's going to be, a little, maybe it's whatever, kind of like a stressful version of summer camp or something. And as soon as we stepped off the bus, we had all these instructors shouting at us, this isn't the fucking chair force, get on your face, start doing push-ups, flutter kicks, just, it was way more intense than I expected. The first week, they probably wouldn't like me telling you guys this, but the first week, the meals, it was called 0 week because technically that week doesn't count because you're just in processing and going through immunizations and medical stuff and whatever. And during that week, we had so much to do. We didn't sleep that first night. I think we were given 15 seconds per meal to eat. It was just chaotic. And later, what I learned was, the Air Force had this sort of image problem because in the wake of 9/11, a lot of Air Force members were deploying with the Army and the Marines, and they were falling out. They were out of shape. They were not held to the same physical standards, throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. And so then, the Air Force leadership they were embarrassed by this, and they completely revamped the training program, and they attempted to make basic training mirror kind of the Army program. They were trying to make us as tough as Army soldiers or Marines. They were probably failing. I don't think we were probably not as tough as them, but they were trying to do that to us. And so it really sucked. It was 8 weeks of 5 hours of sleep per night and getting screamed at and so on and so forth. And in the moment, I hated it. I saw this TikTok video a few weeks ago, and it was in an Army barracks, and I see this probably 19-year-old kid. He has his phone out, and he's asking all of his bunkmates, if you could go back and talk to your recruiter, what would you say? And these other 18, 19-year-old boys are like, I would tell my recruiter, fuck you. I hate this. This sucks. And I'm watching this video, and I'm thinking, yeah, I think a lot of people in that situation early on in training, when you're treated so poorly, it sucks. But then I think about how those guys will feel in 5 years and in 10 years and in 20 years, and they'll be glad that they did that. And that's how I feel. That was exactly the experience I needed. Now, that's not military life isn't all like that. Once you get through training, once you reach a certain rank, you do get treated like an adult, but from roughly 18 to 22, early rank, you're monitored very closely. and you sort of have to earn your keep. So I was enlisted for 8 years in total. I signed up for 4, and then when I was 21, I realized that I wasn't ready yet to exit that sort of rigid structure of the military. I'd learned a few lessons. One was that I think we overrate motivation. A lot of people think that if they want to do something, they need to be motivated, or I lack motivation, or the reason why I'm not achieving these things is that I just, I don't have that drive. But what I learned in the military was that you don't need motivation, you need discipline. Often what separates successful from unsuccessful people is doing things that you don't feel motivated to do and doing it anyway. First, that kind of discipline came from the top down, from the instructors in basic training. They imposed this discipline on us, but then later you sort of learn to cultivate it yourself, learning how to do things that you hate repeatedly, and then gradually you start to notice a difference in your life. Something as simple as learning a new skill, or going to the gym, or writing a book, or some other sort of long-term project. You just force yourself to do it day in and day out, and then a year goes by and you realize you've become a different person. So I signed up for 4 more years. Finally, at age 25, I felt mature enough and self-sufficient enough to leave that structure of the military. I'd been stationed in Washington State. I was stationed in Germany. I did a couple of deployments in Kyrgyzstan and Qatar, and traveled all throughout Europe during that time too. And by that point, I knew I had the GI Bill, but I also knew that my academic record was unimpressive. I'd taken some night classes at a local community college. I finally took the SAT, and I think that saved me when I applied to colleges. So some of you may know that I ended up going to Yale, and when I was interviewing with the admissions officer at Yale, she's like, okay, so you have good scores, your grades from community college look great, but she's like, I'm looking at your high school transcript, and this does not look like the typical Yale applicant's transcript. And she asked me to explain this to her, and I told her a shorter version of what I'm telling all of you today. And I have a lot of criticisms of higher ed in general, Yale in particular, but to their credit, they did admit me, and I entered this new world. In my mind, I kind of mentally separate sort of my life pre-college and post-college, because when I went to Yale, that's really when my life completely changed. And so at Yale, it was probably impossible for me to go through that experience and remain unchanged, just being in that environment of ambitious, smart, hardworking people. And that was what it was like for the first maybe 2 months. So I got out of the Air Force in August, started class in September, and then in October, there was an incident that occurred on campus. Some of you may be familiar with, became known as the Halloween costume controversy with the Christakuses. Some of you may have seen the viral videos of these students mobbing this professor and screaming at him. This was Nicholas Christakis, because his wife had written this innocuous email defending academic freedom, or freedom of expression rather. And he supported his wife through all of this, and the students responded by calling him disgusting and racist and all these other terms, because it was his wife, criticized this idea of cultural appropriation and this idea that students should be careful about what Halloween costumes they wear. And so I'm witnessing this. I thought it was strange. I asked the students to explain to me why this was controversial, just criticizing the idea of cultural appropriation and defending the rights of students to just sort of wear what they want and do what they want. And students would get mad at me for asking these questions. They would say, there was one girl who, she grew up in Greenwich and went to Exeter, and then went to Yale. And I asked her, I made a remark to her that I didn't understand why that was so controversial, this email. And she looked at me and said I was too privileged to understand the pain that these professors had caused. And I thought, well, if I'm privileged, what was her life like? And so I had a lot of interactions like that. And then I would have these conversations with students about how we needed to, it was like this decarceration movement. We need to close down the prisons. We need to, this was sort of the early, this was 2015, 2016, the early days. So defund the police as a movement hadn't yet taken off. But the early sort of intellectual groundwork was being laid at elite universities, including Yale. And so a lot of students thought that, yeah, we should close down the prisons and free all the criminals, and somehow this would make our society better. A lot of the students had criticisms of the nuclear family or traditional family structures. They thought that we should abandon them or leave them behind. But then when I would talk to those students about their own families, every single one of them, they were raised by two married parents, both of their birth parents. And then I would ask them how they planned to raise their own kids, and they would say, oh, I'm going to raise my kids the way that I was raised. But then their official public position was that we need to reimagine the way that we think about family and leave behind these outdated patriarchal norms of marriage and monogamy. I took this class, I majored in psychology. I took this class and I read this paper about moral psychology, and these researchers, one of the authors was Jonathan Haidt, who some of you may be familiar with. This was a paper published in the 90s. And one of the questions they presented to participants around the world, so they recruited participants in Brazil, India, and the US. And they asked participants questions, including one involving incest, sort of brother-sister incest. And it was something like, you know, there's not going to be pregnancy, everyone uses birth control, but there's a brother and sister and they would like to sleep with each other. Is this okay? And unsurprisingly, the vast majority of participants around the world thought this was disgusting, and they said this is not okay. But there was one notable exception. There was one group of participants that were more likely to say it was okay versus not okay, that it's incest, as long as no one's hurt and there's no pregnancy and so on, that this can be okay. And these were students at elite universities. Elite university students were more likely than not to say, as long as no harm is being done and you have two consenting adults, what's the big deal? And this, I mean, this is interestingly, it was true across cultures. So elite college students in Brazil, India, and the US. And so I read this result in this paper for this class. And at that time, I was still perhaps a bit innocent to, I just found it unbelievable. Now it's very easily believable to me. But at that point, it was unbelievable. And so I would just, you know, put on my little anthropologist hat and go around and I would ask students, hey, like I just read this paper or whatever, and then I would like say, like, there's this scenario, like, what do you think about that? And more often than not, students would say, like, what's the big deal? Like, it's weird, I know it's a little weird or whatever, but like, you know, no one's being hurt, right? It's okay. I would present like variations of it too. Like I would start to get weird with it. I was like, what about like a man and his father, right? Like obviously no pregnancy can result, and you have a grown man and you have his father. And they're like, yeah, that's weird, but like, fine. Like, okay. Sort of different world, different sort of moral frameworks. There's very much sort of a harm-based idea of what morality is, that as long as people apparently, superficially at least, aren't being harmed, then anything goes. And so through those experiences and through a lot of reading, I learned about social class through Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class. I read Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. I read a lot of modern empirical social psychology papers. And then by the time I got to Cambridge for grad school, I coined this term luxury beliefs, and have written about it in various outlets. And this is my concept. This is my term, luxury beliefs, but the idea predates, I mean, this is a long-standing phenomenon, but the basic idea here is that luxury beliefs have, to a large extent, replaced luxury goods. This is a new way to exhibit social status, one's position in society, where you were educated, what kind of job you have. It indicates a certain level of sophistication. So Pierre Bourdieu, in distinction, he was a French sociologist in the mid-20th century. He coined this term cultural capital, and the idea was that people would convert their financial resources into expressions of social class. And so if you're rich, then you go off to an elite school and you spend a lot of time around other well-off people, and you learn sort of arcane, intricate knowledge about, at that point in the mid-20th century, about wine, about art, exotic locales, Latin and ancient Greek, and all of those things still signify status today. But my claim is that this is the latest expression of cultural capital. These are luxury beliefs. And in my book, I go through sort of different beliefs, and I cite survey data indicating repeatedly that if you break down the responses by income category, the highest income Americans are the most likely to support defunding the police, the most likely to claim that it's unimportant for parents to be married if they have children, the most likely to support sort of the decriminalization of hard drugs and other luxury beliefs. And so I was mostly writing for myself, like this luxury beliefs idea, and I was putting it out there, sort of seeing, like, do other people connect with this? Am I crazy? Am I missing something? And I've been shocked at just how much interest there has been in this idea. And it's funny, as an academic, you can write research papers, peer-reviewed papers, articles, and most of it will never get any attention. But the luxury beliefs idea, it started as a Twitter thread. I just wrote this thread in 2019. I think Yoram Hazony retweeted it, and then it got picked up by other outlets, and then people started asking me to write more about it. And yeah, from there, the idea took off. Now it has its own Wikipedia page. It had luxury beliefs had a Wikipedia page before I did. And so it was like one of these things, luxury beliefs. It was coined by social commentator Rob Henderson, but there was no hyperlink for Rob Henderson. And so people were like, who the fuck is this guy? So anyway, we can probably wrap it up there. We can do some Q&A. If you have more questions about luxury beliefs or anything else I spoke about, please ask away. So thank you. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, in the book, one idea that they talk about is this kind of concept of trickle-down meritocracy, which I kind of see being a factor in college admissions, or kind of affirmative action on the whole. So could you kind of talk a bit about that? And, yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, the question is about this idea I write in the book. I call it trickle-down meritocracy. Sometimes I'll refer to it as trickle-down diversity. And so it's a play on this idea of trickle-down economics, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, this idea that, oh, if we just let the rich keep their money, that somehow this will naturally sort of benefit everyone else. So it's an argument to lower the tax rate for the wealthy. But the trickle-down meritocracy idea is this belief that as long as the belief at a lot of elite institutions seems to be that as long as the top 1% mirror the demographics of society as a whole, then somehow we've achieved social justice, that we've achieved equity. And so, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, how American society as a whole looks, as long as the student body at Harvard or Yale is whatever, 50% women and X% black, X% LGBT, and so on and so forth. And if we don't have those demographics mirroring the broader society, then somehow we failed. And so that becomes the metric. But my criticism here is that, like, what difference does it make to poor and marginalized communities across the country if, you know, a bunch of upper middle class kids from whatever background go off to Harvard? I actually think in some ways this idea that, like, this narrow-minded idea of what success looks like, it might actually backfire. So what places like Harvard, what they do is they strip mine talented and ambitious people out of their communities. So, you know, kid from Red Bluff, California goes off to Yale, he's not going back to Red Bluff. Some kid from rural Ohio goes off to Stanford, he's probably not going back to Ohio. He's going to move to San Francisco, he's going to move to LA, he's going to move to New York. And so gradually we have this reshuffling of society where coastal institutions go into these neighborhoods, these regions, these parts of the country, they identify smart, talented, capable kids, and then we all just sort of hang out with each other, and then we lose touch with reality, we lose touch with where we came from. And yet, like, somehow these elite institutions, they think that they're doing something noble. We pat ourselves on the back for this. Oh, we have more kids from this region, or more kids from this background. And I think what ends up happening is this is one reason, or one factor that fuels luxury beliefs, I think, is that gradually you just have a bunch of people from similar institutions, educated in the same places, that are all brought together and sort of socialize with one another, and through osmosis and just through sort of group polarization, they start to believe crazy things. This is a basic principle in social psychology, this idea of group polarization. And an example of this would be if you take 5 people who all tentatively hold a certain view. Like, let's say you have 5 people and they all, if you give them the choice, who do you like more, the Red Sox or the Yankees? And these 5 people, they kind of weakly hold this view that the Red Sox are better. They're not wedded to this idea, but all 5 of them are like, yeah, I kind of prefer the Red Sox. And then you put them in a room and say, we want you to talk about baseball for an hour. When those 5 people exit the room, they're all going to be much more adamant that the Red Sox are the best. What seems to happen is when people sort of hold an opinion lightly, but then they interact with other people who also hold that view, it crystallizes that opinion, it strengthens it. Part of it is just because we want to get along with each other. And so if you and I are speaking and we both find some common ground, we'll double down on it in order to increase our social bond. And I think that happens with a lot of socio-political opinions at elite institutions, that we all want to be compassionate, we all hold these views, I don't really know, but then over time we interact long enough and we start to believe in crazy things. So, other questions? Yeah.
Do you think luxury beliefs are a problem conceptually, or do you think it's purely incidental to what they currently substantively are? So for example, in like medieval France, when people are trying to build the cathedrals, right, build Notre Dame, for example, they had to take from the countryside both physical resources, talent, material. Was that equally a problem as it is now? Because it seems like this idea of elitism, it's not unique to the American context. It just seems like, is the problem substance? It's just incidental? Or do you think there's actually a conceptual problem with it?
I think it's substantive more so than conceptual, the way that so yeah, the question is, there have been different ways that society's been structured. We've always had elites. We've always sort of recruited people and had social stratification. Is there an issue with the stratification in itself, or is there a problem with just sort of how it's expressed in any particular time and place in society, in a given society? Yeah, I think it's more substantive. I mean, stratification exists. Every society has elites. I'm not anti-elite. I think some people read my writings and my criticisms of elite institutions and some of the people who inhabit them. But I'm not like a Marxist or something. I don't think we should tear everything down and have a revolution. I just want our elites to be better, and I think elites are capable of being better. It's one reason among others that I'm willing to speak at places like this. I think most elites are trying to do the right thing, but they're confused and they feel a lot of guilt, and they don't spend a lot of time around the people who they claim to care about, and so they'll listen to some activist who claims to speak on behalf of those communities. In 2020, I think there was a widespread belief that like the defund the police movement was supported by Black and Hispanic people, and that's was the right opinion to hold because that's what they thought that those marginalized communities wanted. And yet, when you look at the survey data, I mean, regardless, so even if you just look at Democrats, there were multiple surveys in 2020 and 2021 that found that among Democrats, white Democrats were by far the most supportive of defunding the police. And yet, I think if you spoke with graduates of places like Harvard and Yale, they would think like, oh no, it's you know, the police are, or rather, these marginalized people, they don't like police because of the history of oppression and so on. But actually, often when you look at survey data, it almost consistently points to the opposite of whatever prestige media would have you believe. So, other questions? Yep, Sarah?
I think there's a similar idea out there about suicidal empathy. Perhaps it gets to
It's like GADSADs.
Yeah.
Okay.
That kind of gets like thrown around as a proxy for this like elite, uniquely Western sentiment of, you know, we have to make up for, like in a reparative way, for all the wrongs that the West has committed around the world throughout the past several hundred years, that type of thing. And I wonder if that is related in a non-economic sense to luxury beliefs, or if that is a kind of like similar and adjacent core issue to the existence of luxury beliefs.
They're probably connected in some way. So yeah, the question is about suicidal empathy and about how a lot of Western elites, they become so sort of sentimental and they overindulge those compassionate, empathic instincts to the detriment of their societies. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I suppose. I think there's an issue here. I guess one way that these suicidal empathy and luxury beliefs are linked is that it's suicidal, but not for the individual. It's for the broader society. And this is the idea behind luxury beliefs, is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And so, you know, if you graduate from an elite institution and you have a comfortable upper middle class living and you live in a safe and gated community, you know, you can express high levels of empathy and vote to decriminalize drugs and abolish police and support ideas like polyamory and what have you, and all in the name of compassion and open-mindedness. But and you yourself, though, are living in a gated community where people are married and not doing drugs and aren't, being mugged in the streets. And so yeah, I don't necessarily, it's suicidal, but like not for the self. So I guess like maybe I take issue with that phrasing, suicidal for the society, but not for the actual individual expressing it. Which, yeah, so that's I think where the luxury beliefs idea comes in. So other thoughts, yeah.
What do you think can be done about this geographic concentration of elites you mentioned that sort of takes people away from the people they supposedly care about and want to represent?
What can be done? So what can be done about the geographic concentration of elites? You know, people get reshuffled off into elite institutions, and then they move to the same cities and cluster in the same neighborhoods and interact with each other and not with others. So I mean, weirdly, I think, so the elite schools are always going to be, like Harvard is, you know, it's been around since, what, 1630 something. It's going to be around for a long time. It's always going to have a certain mystique and power with that brand. So people are always going to try to get into a place like this. But I do think that a lot of the self-inflicted controversies have sort of diluted the brands a bit. I think like a lot of students, I mean, we'll have to see, you know, how people vote with their feet, but I do see more and more people who are skeptical of sending their kids off to places like this. And so, you know, maybe indirectly, these blunders that these universities have committed over time will reduce the numbers of students who are interested in going to them, or reduce the number of parents who are eager to pay tuition to send their kids to a place like this. But I do think there's maybe value in something like what JD did, JD Vance. You know, he went off to Yale Law and then lived in San Francisco and then eventually resettled in Ohio. You know, not exactly where he grew up. I think he's in Cincinnati, or he was in Cincinnati. And that was a sort of conscious decision to help to restore his community and his state and so on. And I think maybe, just getting that message out there that Robert Frank, the Cornell economist, has this book, I think it's called How Big Is Your Pond? And it's about, one of the ideas in that book is about being like a small fish in a big pond versus a big fish in a small pond. And so look, if you are an accomplished and successful person and then you go back to your kind of rundown hometown or home state, you'll be able to sort of climb the ladder a lot faster than if you go off to New York with a bunch of other highly successful, ambitious people. The ladder to success is less greasy to climb up if you go back to your sort of working class town or something like that. So maybe one more question. Yeah.
So you mentioned how the issue with luxury beliefs is that those who hold them are then sort of removed from the actual impact of those beliefs. But I'm wondering then if we're kind of taking this model and kind of being able to apply it toward those elites that have luxury beliefs, either actively or passively. What's then the purpose of sort of illuminating this sort of distinction? Because it seems that sort of tearing down these ideas can kind of lead people to a sort of skepticism, as in not being able to have any sort of beliefs, or not being able to have an actual effective impact. Are we leading them to instead to some sort of ideal of what these beliefs should be and how they should guide their actions, or is it just a deconstruction?
Well, when I coined the term luxury beliefs, and maybe this was just the academic in me at that time, but I gave it a very narrow definition. Sometimes people ask me, can there be good luxury beliefs? And the definition I gave it, these are ideas and opinions that confer status on the elite while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And so almost by definition, a luxury belief can't be good. And so yeah, through speaking about it, I do hope to call people's attention to the possibility that just because you express a view and it sounds good and the people around you are expressing it and all the right-thinking people at places like Harvard and Yale are expressing it, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are going to be, they're going to improve the lives of the people you claim to be helping. But I also, through these conversations and through writing, I try to nudge people in the direction of, look, you have a unique responsibility if you're fortunate enough to be educated at a place like this, and you have a platform and you have some influence, and just again, despite all the self-inflicted controversies and everything, if you tell people you went to a place like this, they're going to be slightly more likely to listen to you. And so what do you do with that responsibility? Do you promote ideas that are destructive or productive? And I think elites used to be more, there was this idea of noblesse oblige, of sort of helping the downtrodden, of this obligation. Sometimes I jokingly claim that we should go back to the, and we're at Harvard, so that maybe this is an apropos example of the John F. Kennedy model of hypocrisy, of elite hypocrisy. So John F. Kennedy, as we know, he presented himself to the public as a good husband and a good father and a family man, and we know that behind closed doors he was a very different person. Often absent, he wasn't the best husband, the best father, he philandered and so on. We all know that story. But he still thought it was important to set that example to the public of, here's sort of the aspirational image of manhood, of you should be a good husband, a good father, and be present and be a good partner and so on. Whereas now we almost have the reverse of that kind of hypocrisy. Some of you may be familiar with this book, The Meritocracy Trap. So I know Michael Sandel here at Harvard has, I think it's The Tyranny of Meritocracy, and then Daniel Markovits at the Yale Law School wrote The Meritocracy Trap. It was like a fad for a couple of years, attacking meritocracy. But one of the things that Daniel Markovits writes about in his book is he uses this term, our elites are non-practicing libertines. In other words, elites, their public attitude is, you know, whatever you want to do. If you want to do drugs and live in a polycule and have the time of your life, and who am I to judge? Do your thing. But then privately, how do elites live their lives? They're the most likely to get married, the most likely to have kids in wedlock, and prioritize family and education and hard work and responsibility. And what lessons do they impart in their kids? You know, they drill their kids to go to college and be successful. And so the old model was publicly uphold these conventional views and maybe privately fail to live up to them. And now it's publicly espouse potentially destructive values while privately abiding by those conventional values. And I think I'll leave it there. So thank you.